There's a hole growing in the floor of Lake Mead, and almost nobody is talking about it. Not a metaphorical hole, a literal, documented geological void, sitting beneath one of the largest man-made reservoirs in the entire Western Hemisphere, right at the base of a structure that holds back enough water to bury the state of Connecticut under 14 feet. Now, before you assume this is exaggeration, I want to walk you through the actual science here, because the real story is, in some ways, more interesting than the headline. Geologists and structural engineers have been tracking a specific set of conditions around Lake Mead and Hoover Dam for decades. And those conditions involve three things happening simultaneously. The slow dissolution of limestone bedrock beneath the lake, a documented history of earthquakes triggered by the reservoir itself, and the looming question of what a serious seismic event in this region would actually do to an aging 1930s-era dam. That's what we're here to dig into today. No manufactured panic, just the geology, the engineering record, and what the models actually say. To understand the threat, you have to understand what Lake Mead actually sits on, and the answer is genuinely unsettling. The lake sits in a basin in the Mojave Desert, straddling the Nevada-Arizona border. Visually, it looks like solid rock country. The canyon walls are dramatic, the geology looks ancient and immovable. But what you can't see from the surface is the composition of the rock underneath. A significant portion of the geology beneath and around Lake Mead includes limestone and dolomite formations, sedimentary carbonate rocks. And here's what matters about that. Carbonate rocks dissolve. Slowly, over time, slightly acidic water, and all groundwater is at least mildly acidic, works through the fractures and bedding planes of limestone and carves out voids. This process is called karstification, and the landscape it creates is called karst terrain. Karst terrain is famous for one thing above all else: sinkholes. When the underground voids grow large enough that the ceiling can no longer support its own weight, or the weight of whatever's above it, the surface collapses, suddenly, without warning. Now here's the thing that geologists identified fairly early. In the history of Lake Mead, filling the reservoir didn't just change the surface. The sheer weight of the water, at full capacity, Lake Mead holds approximately 26.1 million acre-feet of water, which translates to something close to 36 trillion pounds of additional pressure on the earth below, accelerated the movement of water through those rock formations. The hydraulic pressure changed, groundwater pathways shifted, and the dissolution process, which had been happening naturally for millennia, got a significant push forward. There are documented sinkholes in the Lake Mead Basin. Some are submerged. Some have appeared in the surrounding land. The U.S. Geological Survey and the Bureau of Reclamation have tracked karst features in this region for years, precisely because they matter for the long-term integrity of the surrounding geology. That's not conspiracy. That's standard civil engineering due diligence. Here's the part that the standard coverage of this region almost never mentions. Lake Mead doesn't just sit passively on an earthquake-prone region. In a very real, documented, scientifically established way, Lake Mead causes earthquakes. This isn't a fringe theory. The phenomenon is called reservoir-induced seismicity, and it is one of the most well-studied intersections of human engineering and geological response in existence. When you fill a massive reservoir, the weight of the water changes the stress on the underlying rock. It also lubricates fault lines. Water under pressure reduces the friction that was keeping those faults locked in place. The result? Earthquakes that would not have happened, or would have happened much later, get triggered by the presence of the reservoir itself. Lake Mead is one of the historically documented examples of this effect. When the reservoir was first filled in the late 1930s, there was a notable increase in local seismic activity. Researchers studying the area identified what became known as the Lake Mead seismic zone, a cluster of seismic activity directly correlated with water level fluctuations in the reservoir. What that means in plain terms, when the lake fills up, earthquake frequency in the region goes up. When the lake drops, it tends to quiet down. The water level and the seismic record have tracked each other for decades. And here's where that gets relevant right now. After years of historic drought and record low water levels, Lake Mead is beginning a slow recovery. As water levels rise again, geologists who study this area are watching very closely, because the rock formations beneath the lake have been drying, shifting, and adjusting to years of reduced hydraulic pressure. When significant water weight returns, and it is returning, those formations will respond. The Mead seismic zone sits in a broader regional context that includes several active fault systems: the Las Vegas Valley Shear Zone, the Lake Mead Fault System, and proximity to the larger Basin and Range Seismic Province, which is one of the most seismically active continental interior regions in the world. Utah, Nevada, and Arizona collectively host a seismic landscape that most people associate with California, but rarely think about in their own backyard. So let's talk about the seismic worst case, not as a prediction, but as a documented modeling scenario that engineers and geologists have actually run. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake is an extreme event. To put it in context, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake off the coast of Japan was a 9.0. It was one of the 5 most powerful earthquakes ever recorded in human history. The direct seismic zone near Lake Mead is not currently believed to be capable of producing a 9.0 event from nearby faults alone. But the Basin and Range Province, and the broader network of faults across the Intermountain West, is part of a connected seismic system, and structural assessments of large dams have historically included what engineers call maximum credible earthquake scenarios, the upper bound of what they believe the site could realistically experience, accounting not just for local faults, but for transmitted seismic energy from larger regional events. The specific concern with Hoover Dam and a major seismic event isn't necessarily the dam structure shattering in one dramatic moment. The concern is more nuanced, and in some ways, more dangerous. Seismic shaking accelerating the progression of existing geological weaknesses. Karst voids that were stable under normal conditions are not necessarily stable under the kind of ground acceleration produced by a major earthquake. Bedrock fractures that were holding slowly begin propagating. Water that was contained begins finding new pathways through cracked and shifted limestone. And the sinkholes, which, as we established, are already a documented feature of this geology, get a trigger. A scenario involving a major regional earthquake, a sudden rapid loss of structural integrity in the karst substrate beneath the lake, and a catastrophic drawdown of Lake Mead is something that geological engineers don't treat as impossible. They treat it as a low probability, high consequence event, exactly the kind of risk that dam safety programs exist to assess. Whether the probability is low enough to be dismissible is a judgment call that reasonable experts continue to debate. This isn't entirely theoretical, because parts of it are already happening. The Bureau of Reclamation has documented karst dissolution features in the Lake Mead area for years. Underwater surveys of portions of the lakebed have identified void spaces and areas of unconsolidated sediment that sit above dissolved limestone formations. Some of these features are relatively minor, some are not. In 2022, as Lake Mead hit historically low levels, and large sections of the lakebed were exposed for the first time in decades, something interesting happened. Researchers and observers noticed areas of disturbed, fractured, and subsided lakebed in sections that had been underwater for most of the reservoir's existence. Some of this was attributed to straightforward sediment dynamics. Some of it raised questions. There's also the matter of the grout curtain, the injected concrete barrier beneath Hoover Dam that was designed to seal the rock formation and prevent water from migrating under the structure. Grout curtains are standard practice in large dam construction, and they're effective. But they operate on a finite timeline. Grout in fractured rock is subject to the same dissolution pressures as the rock itself, and, in a karst-influenced geology, the long-term integrity of any sealing system requires ongoing monitoring. The Bureau of Reclamation does perform regular inspections of Hoover Dam. They inject new grout where needed. Seepage monitoring systems have been in place for decades. None of this suggests the dam is on the verge of imminent failure under normal conditions. What it does suggest is that this is an active, ongoing challenge, not a solved problem. Hoover Dam is an extraordinary piece of engineering, built in the 1930s, designed for the geology and climate models of the 1930s. Think about what that means for a moment. When the engineers who designed Hoover Dam ran their calculations, they were working with the geological survey data available at the time, the seismic hazard models of the 1930s, and assumptions about long-term water levels based on the hydrology they'd observed. They didn't have supercomputers running finite element analyses of the dam's stress distribution under 100 different earthquake scenarios. They didn't have 80 years of reservoir-induced seismicity data to incorporate into their models. They were brilliant engineers working at the absolute frontier of what was technically possible. The dam is 726 feet tall and contains 3.25 million cubic yards of concrete. By the standards of any era, it is a staggering achievement, and it has performed remarkably for nearly 90 years. But the engineering conversation has evolved significantly since 1935. Modern dam safety assessments use probabilistic seismic hazard analysis. They don't just ask, what earthquake have we seen? They ask what earthquake could occur, how likely is it over a 100-year period, and what happens to this structure if it does. When the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the Bureau of Reclamation apply modern seismic standards to Hoover Dam, the picture is more complicated than the dam's iconic status suggests. Seismic upgrade projects for aging large dams have become a significant part of the Bureau's capital program over the past 2 decades, because the gap between when these structures were built and what modern hazard modeling tells us can be substantial. Hoover Dam's design was also optimized for the hydrology of the early 20th century Colorado River, a river system that is now, under the combined pressure of prolonged drought and changing precipitation patterns, behaving fundamentally differently than it did when the dam was designed. The load cycles the structure experiences as the lake drops and rises dramatically, rather than sitting near capacity as it was designed to do, are not the cycles the original engineers modeled. Concrete under cyclical load stress behaves differently than concrete under constant load. This is not a secret. Engineers talk about it. The Bureau of Reclamation publishes reports about it. It just doesn't make the evening news. Here's what makes this conversation matter beyond geology textbooks. Hoover Dam isn't just a structure. It is the single point of failure for a water system that serves approximately 25 million people across Nevada, Arizona, California, and parts of Mexico. It provides water to the Las Vegas metropolitan area, the fastest growing major city in the American West. It provides hydroelectric power to the regional grid, and the Colorado River below it is the water supply backbone for agriculture that feeds a significant portion of the country. When engineers and emergency planners model infrastructure failure scenarios, the downstream consequences of a catastrophic Lake Mead failure are genuinely difficult to fully capture. The volume of water behind that dam, released rapidly, would transform the Colorado River into something unrecognizable. Communities in the flood path, Laughlin, Needles, Parker, Yuma, would face events that dwarf anything in their recorded history. This is why the monitoring systems exist. This is why dam safety is a federal program. This is why the Bureau of Reclamation invests significant resources in inspections and structural assessments, because the people who work in this field understand the stakes with complete clarity. The question worth asking, and I think it's a fair one, is whether the funding and urgency that this level of risk warrants is actually being applied at the scale the situation demands. Now, to be fair, this isn't being completely ignored. The Bureau of Reclamation does operate a comprehensive dam safety program. Hoover Dam has monitoring instrumentation embedded throughout its structure. Sensors that track seepage, internal stress, and movement with ongoing data collection. There are emergency action plans in place for various failure scenarios. The dam undergoes formal safety reviews. In 2021, the federal infrastructure bill included funding for dam safety and rehabilitation programs across the country. There are engineers and geologists actively working on exactly these questions. The intersection of seismic hazard, karst geology, and aging infrastructure. But here's the tension that's worth sitting with. The pace of geological change and seismic risk assessment has accelerated dramatically with modern computational tools. What we now know about the fault systems in the basin and range, about reservoir-induced seismicity, about karst progression beneath the lake, It's a substantially more complex picture than what the original dam safety frameworks were designed around. And there's a gap, which is well documented in engineering literature, between the rate at which our risk understanding evolves and the rate at which large infrastructure is actually upgraded to reflect that understanding. That gap isn't unique to Hoover Dam. It exists across hundreds of large dams in the United States. The Association of State Dam Safety Officials has flagged the aging infrastructure problem as one of the most significant unaddressed civil engineering challenges in the country. The good news, if there is good news here, is that Hoover Dam is one of the most monitored and studied large dams in the world. If there were an early indication of significant structural change, the monitoring systems were designed to catch it. Whether that monitoring is sufficient for the scenarios modern geology suggests are possible is a conversation that deserves more public attention than it currently gets. I'm not telling you this to make you afraid. I'm telling you this because awareness is the first step toward accountability. The geology of Lake Mead, the seismic character of the basin and range, the karst formations beneath the reservoir floor, the engineering legacy of a 1930s dam, these aren't classified files. They're in USGS reports, Bureau of Reclamation publications, peer-reviewed geology journals. They're available to anyone who knows where to look. What they're not is visible. Not in the way a cracked highway or a rusting bridge is visible. The risks we've talked about today live underground, in rock dissolution rates and fault stress models and seepage calculations. They don't show up in your social media feed. They don't make the local news unless something dramatic happens. 25 million people live in the service area of Lake Mead. Most of them have never thought about karst geology, or reservoir-induced seismicity, or grout curtain integrity. And that's completely understandable. That's what the engineers and the regulators are supposed to be thinking about on their behalf. But an informed public is a public that asks better questions of those engineers and regulators. It's a public that supports the funding of dam safety programs. It's a public that holds infrastructure investment to a standard that matches the actual risk. If this is the first time you've heard any of this, good. That's exactly why this channel exists. Not to tell you the sky is falling, but to hand you the tools to look up and evaluate it yourself. The dam still stands. The lake still fills. The desert is still stunning. And somewhere beneath the surface, the water keeps finding its way through the rock. If you want to keep going deeper on the stories that don't fit neatly into a 3-minute news segment, the geological risks, the infrastructure questions, the things that take real explanation to understand, stick around. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because the next time I publish something you'll want to see, YouTube isn't going to tell you about it unless you ask it to. There's more to come. And it only gets more interesting from here.